There are moments in life when everything changes in the blink of an eye. 1 minute, you're going about your day, your biggest problem the cold cup of coffee you're holding. And the next, you're face to face with a person whose casual comment might just alter the course of your entire existence. This was one of those moments. It started on a chilly fall afternoon at the Parkview Hotel, a luxurious establishment perched on the edge of downtown, known for its impeccable service and pristine reputation. The lobby, gleaming with marble floors and sparkling chandeliers, looked like something straight out of a movie. The staff, impeccably dressed in their uniforms, moved gracefully between guests, each interaction precise and carefully orchestrated. Jack, a young waiter in his mid-20s, was behind the bar polishing glasses, his mind not on the task at hand but rather on his own discontent. He'd been working at the Parkview Hotel for the last 2 years, his dreams of being someone important constantly crushed by the monotonous routine. The wealthy patrons who frequented the hotel seemed so out of reach, so aloof. Jack had lost count of how many times he'd served drinks and food to people whose names he didn't even bother remembering. They came, they drank, they ate, and then they left. And Jack was still stuck, cleaning up after them. "Hey, you got any more of that fancy scotch?" a man's voice broke through his thoughts. Jack looked up from the counter, a little annoyed that his daydreaming had been interrupted. The man standing before him was dressed casually, dark jeans, a black t-shirt, a faded leather jacket. He didn't have the usual air of wealth that Jack had come to expect from the hotel's clientele. He looked ordinary. Unremarkable. Jack, who was growing increasingly bitter about his life, couldn't help but roll his eyes internally. Another guest who likely thought he was too good for the place. "Sure," Jack said, his tone cool but forced, reaching for the bottle of top-shelf scotch that was typically reserved for VIP guests. The man nodded, sitting at the bar with an air of ease, not bothering to look up. "Thanks. Keep it coming," he added, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Jack couldn't place it, but something about the man's demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. He had that too casual attitude that grated against Jack's growing frustration. As Jack poured the drink, his frustration with his own situation bubbled over. He'd been waiting for a chance to vent, and this man, seemingly a stranger with no real sense of status, was the perfect target. "So, what brings you to this dump?" Jack asked, his voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. "Another rich guy looking for a place to feel important?" The man turned his head, the faintest glimmer of surprise crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. "I'm just here to relax, nothing too fancy. You know, sometimes it's nice to get away from the attention." Jack snorted. "Attention? If you want to get away from that, you should have picked a different hotel. This place is crawling with people who want to flaunt their money." The man leaned back in his seat, casually swirling the scotch in his glass. "Yeah, I suppose. But that's the problem, right? Everyone's too busy acting like they're better than everyone else." Jack's patience was wearing thin. He couldn't help himself, he had to say it. The words just tumbled out, a mixture of bitterness and disdain. Well, it must be nice to be so relaxed when you're probably just another spoiled rich guy. "I bet the world revolves around you, huh?" The man's smile faltered, but he didn't say anything at first. Jack, oblivious to the potential consequences of his words, continued cleaning the glass with exaggerated movements, his frustration building with each passing second. "You know, it's funny," Jack continued, his voice growing more bold. "People like you think you can just come in here, throw some money around, and treat people like they're invisible. Well, I'm not your servant. I'm just here doing my job, and I don't need to kiss anyone's behind to make a living." The man stared at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if considering something. Then, with a deep breath, he simply nodded and took another sip of his scotch. For a moment, there was silence, as if the tension between them had thickened in the air. Jack, feeling smug about his little rant, finally looked up and gave the man a cocky grin. "Yeah, you might want to remember that next time." I'm not your typical hotel staff." At that, the man chuckled softly. He seemed to shrug off the harsh words as if they hadn't fazed him. "You know, it's funny," he said again, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken weight. "You never know who you're talking to." He set the glass down with a soft clink. Jack raised an eyebrow, not quite sure what the man was getting at, but he felt a twinge of unease. Something about this encounter didn't sit right with him. Before he could ask any further questions, the man stood up, dropped a hefty tip on the counter, and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, Jack was still fuming. The nerve of that guy. What was his deal? He felt like he'd just unloaded his frustrations onto the wrong person, but at the time, it felt good to speak his mind. The thought of apologizing never crossed his mind, he was too proud, too caught up in his own anger. It wasn't until later that night, when the manager called an emergency staff meeting, that Jack would realize just who he had insulted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't always the face people saw on movie screens or read about in tabloids. His fame, the kind that made people whisper in awe and ask for autographs, wasn't the whole story. In truth, Clint had spent years trying to distance himself from the public persona that the world had built around him. The Hollywood spotlight, once thrilling, had grown unbearably bright. The pressure, the expectations, it was all too much. Years ago, Clint had been one of the biggest names in entertainment. His grizzled voice, stoic expression, and on-screen presence had captured the imagination of audiences everywhere. From westerns to action-packed thrillers, Clint was the type of actor who didn't just portray characters, he became them. He had built an empire, not just through his acting, but also his directing, producing, and involvement in nearly every aspect of the business. But with success came a price. The world became a blur of fame, parties, and constant public scrutiny. Clint's life, once simple and driven by his passion for film, had become something he could barely recognize. Every step was measured. Every decision scrutinized. And worst of all, he was always on display. For someone like Clint, who thrived in solitude, it felt suffocating. After years of this, Clint made the decision to step away. He no longer wanted to be in front of the camera. He didn't want to be the subject of conversation. So, he found his escape, a place where he could live in peace, where he could be Clint Eastwood, not the icon, but the man. It was in the business world where he found this new sense of purpose. He had always been a fan of hospitality. Hotels, especially, held a certain charm for him, the way they catered to people, making them feel welcomed, important, even for just a night. It wasn't about celebrity or fame. It was about serving others, giving them something they needed. The idea resonated with him deeply. In the early 2000s, Clint quietly purchased the Parkview Hotel, a majestic yet modest luxury establishment on the outskirts of downtown. It was nothing like the glitzy hotels in the heart of the city. The Parkview was a sanctuary for those who appreciated understated elegance and impeccable service. It was a place where people came to feel at home, whether they were businessmen, travelers, or even celebrities, though Clint always preferred to remain in the background. He managed the hotel, not with the intention of making headlines, but as a way to escape the frantic pace of the limelight. No one knew Clint owned the Parkview. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations, but he was always around, watching quietly, making decisions from the shadows. He would occasionally visit the hotel in casual clothes, blending in with the crowd, sometimes even acting as a regular guest, observing the staff, their interactions with patrons, and the general flow of things. This was his life now. No press conferences. No red carpets. No demands from fans. Clint was content with his anonymity, happy to be in control without the world knowing who he was. It was in this new phase of his life that he found a kind of peace he hadn't had in years. And yet, as much as he tried to keep his identity concealed, there was always the faint whisper of recognition, the occasional, "Hey, you look familiar." Clint had long since perfected the art of deflecting such comments with a small smile or a casual laugh, but there were times when he still felt the old stirrings of his previous life. His face, his name, was just too well known. But Clint wasn't here to make friends with the staff, either. The hotel's operations were mostly smooth, but occasionally, there were little signs of tension, cracks in the otherwise polished facade. It was those cracks that Clint paid attention to. He watched, he listened, and in the shadows, he quietly steered things back on course. Clint had been at the Parkview for a week, just another quiet stay away from the noise of the world. He spent his days walking the grounds, taking in the scenery, observing the guests, and most importantly, keeping a close eye on the staff. Over the years, he had grown fond of the employees here. They weren't just workers to him, they were the lifeblood of the hotel. It wasn't about the flashy luxury or the big names that passed through its doors. It was about the people who made the hotel feel like home. And Clint respected that. It was why he was so intrigued by Jack. Jack was one of the newer additions to the staff. Young, ambitious, but brash and a little too self-assured for someone just starting out. Clint had noticed the way Jack treated the other employees, how he seemed to have little regard for the guests, as if they were all just rich people who didn't deserve respect. There was something dismissive in the way Jack handled himself, and Clint didn't like it. Clint wasn't quick to judge, but the young man's attitude rubbed him the wrong way. He could tell that Jack was smart, but he was also carrying a lot of bitterness. Clint knew that kind of attitude well. It was the same kind of bitterness he had seen in his younger days before fame had taught him humility. It was the kind of attitude that could easily alienate people and hinder personal growth. So Clint decided to do something he rarely did. He decided to pay closer attention to Jack. He would observe him, see how he interacted with the other staff and guests, and figure out what was really going on behind the chip on his shoulder. Clint had seen it before in others, young people with big dreams but no real idea of how to achieve them. It could be frustrating to see someone with potential wasting it, and Clint wasn't going to let that happen if he could help it. But Clint didn't plan to confront Jack outright. He didn't believe in handing people answers. Life didn't work that way. No, he would let Jack figure it out for himself. He had made plenty of mistakes in his own youth, and it had been those mistakes that had shaped him into the man he was today. Still, Clint couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for Jack to realize what he was doing wrong? Would the young man learn his lesson the easy way, or would it take something more dramatic? The answer, Clint realized, would come sooner than he expected. It had been a few days since Jack's heated exchange with the man at the bar. Though Clint Eastwood's name wasn't one that Jack had heard in passing or recognized from the crowd of patrons, there was something about their interaction that lingered. It wasn't just the snarky comment he'd thrown out into the world, but the way the man had reacted, or rather, didn't react. The way he had taken Jack's insults so casually, as if he had heard them before. Clint had seemed almost unfazed. In Jack's world, that wasn't normal. People got defensive, or they stood up for themselves, especially when challenged. But Clint? He just smiled and walked away. Jack couldn't shake the odd feeling that had crept into his mind. It was like he had been playing with fire and had no idea how close he was to getting burned. But the more he thought about it, the more his anger swelled. Who did that guy think he was? Coming into the hotel, acting like he was above it all, then brushing off Jack's words without a second thought. Jack had been working here for years. He knew how to spot a guest who thought they could get away with anything. And Clint, with his expensive taste and calm demeanor, was just like all the others. Rich, entitled, and oblivious to the struggles of people like Jack. The next few days at the hotel felt like a building storm. Jack threw himself into his work, but his frustration festered. He found himself stewing over everything, his unfulfilling job, the endless parade of customers, and, of course, Clint Eastwood. The man had crossed a line in Jack's mind. He wasn't just another rich guy, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. The entitled, the privileged, the ones who thought they could walk through life without facing the consequences of their actions. Jack was determined to confront Clint again. He needed to prove a point, to let Clint know that he wasn't just another invisible face behind the counter. He was going to make him understand that people like him couldn't just get away with disrespecting others. It wasn't long before Jack got his chance. It was late in the evening, and the bar was bustling with guests. A few regulars were enjoying their drinks, while a couple of new patrons had settled into the lounge area. Jack was busy cleaning glasses when he saw Clint walk through the door, just like he had a few days ago. The same casual air, the same relaxed confidence. Jack's heart rate quickened. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe a look of recognition, maybe an apology for the way their last encounter had gone, but when Clint simply nodded his head at him in passing, Jack felt his blood boil. This time, Jack wasn't going to let it slide. He casually walked over to Clint's table, his hands gripping the edge of the bar for support. Clint was reading a newspaper, sipping from a glass of scotch, looking completely at ease. The image struck Jack like a punch in the gut. How could anyone be this calm? This composed? After everything Jack had been through, everything he'd struggled to hold on to, here was a man who could walk into a hotel, sit down, and order drinks as if the world was his for the taking. Without thinking, Jack leaned forward and said, "You really think you can just walk in here, ignore everyone around you, and act like you own the place?" Clint lowered the newspaper, his gaze meeting Jack's for the first time in days. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but only for a split second. His eyes, however, remained calm, even patient. He set the paper down and studied Jack for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I don't think I own the place," Clint replied evenly. "But I do think I deserve to be treated with respect, just like anyone else here." Jack felt a wave of frustration wash over him. This wasn't how he had imagined it. He had thought Clint would argue, get defensive, maybe even throw a jab back at him. Instead, Clint had said something simple, something Jack wasn't prepared for: respect. It was the last thing Jack wanted to hear. "You don't get it," Jack shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You walk in here, you look down at people like us, and you think you're above it all. You think because you have money, or fame, or whatever it is, that you can treat everyone like they don't matter." Clint didn't flinch. He remained composed, his expression unreadable. "I never said anyone didn't matter. But if you're going to accuse me of something, you should know what you're talking about first. You don't know a thing about me, Jack." The use of his name hit Jack like a slap to the face. It was as if Clint had been paying attention to him all along, even when Jack hadn't noticed. Clint Eastwood, the man he had insulted just days before, had remembered his name. But Jack wasn't ready to back down. "No," Jack spat. "But I know enough to see through the act. You're just another rich guy who doesn't understand what it's like to be stuck, to feel like the world doesn't care about you." Clint's expression softened ever so slightly, but his voice remained steady. "You're right, Jack. I don't know what it's like to be stuck. But I do know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like you're not being heard." Jack blinked, taken aback. For a moment, he thought Clint might be mocking him, but the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Clint wasn't just another arrogant millionaire. Something deeper, something raw, was hiding beneath that calm exterior. Jack had struck a nerve, but not in the way he had intended. Before Jack could respond, the sound of a distant glass shattering echoed through the bar. Both men turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. A guest had dropped their drink, and the momentary tension between Jack and Clint dissolved, replaced by the chaos of the hotel's bustle. Jack stood there, his mind racing, unsure of what to think. Had Clint just admitted to something? Did he really understand the struggles Jack was going through? Or was it all just more of the same, empty words from someone who didn't actually care? The next few days after the confrontation with Clint felt like a blur to Jack. Despite his attempts to shake off the unease Clint's words had left him with, it was clear that something had shifted inside of him. It was as if the layers of anger and bitterness he had built up over the years were starting to peel away, piece by piece. But Jack wasn't sure he was ready to face that reality just yet. Each day, he found himself haunted by the conversation at the bar, replaying Clint's calm, measured responses over and over in his mind. "I don't know what it's like to be stuck, but I know what it's like to feel invisible." Clint's words kept echoing in his head like a riddle that Jack couldn't solve. He had expected Clint to fight back, to prove that he was just another rich guy who thought he was above everyone else. But Clint hadn't done that. He had listened. And that was something Jack hadn't expected, at least, not from someone like him. But Jack couldn't let himself be lulled into thinking that Clint was anything more than just another wealthy man who had everything handed to him. He refused to believe that Clint, of all people, could truly understand the weight of Jack's struggles. How could he? Clint had everything: fame, wealth, success. Jack had none of those things. So, why would Clint's words have any meaning? Jack's internal conflict only deepened as the days passed. The hotel was busy as usual, guests coming and going, and Jack fell back into his usual routine. He kept his head down, tried to focus on the job, but something kept pulling at him. Every time he passed Clint's table or saw him in the hallway, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort, like he was being drawn into a game he didn't know the rules to. It was on the fourth day after their confrontation that the tipping point finally came. Jack was working the late shift, cleaning the bar and preparing for the hotel's nightly events. The atmosphere was calm, peaceful even, but Jack's nerves were on edge. He kept expecting Clint to show up, to walk in and challenge him again. He wasn't sure what he'd do if that happened. Part of him wanted to lash out again, to put Clint in his place. But another part, the quieter part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, Clint's words had meant something deeper. Around midnight, Clint finally arrived. As always, he was calm, collected, almost serene. He nodded in Jack's direction but didn't approach the bar right away. Instead, Clint made his way to the back corner of the lounge, a place where guests could enjoy their drinks in relative privacy. Jack watched him, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. This was it. This was the moment Jack had been anticipating ever since their last conversation. For a moment, Jack considered ignoring Clint, walking away, pretending like he didn't care. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't solve anything. He had to face this. He had to confront whatever it was that Clint had stirred up inside him. With a deep breath, Jack approached Clint's table, his movements stiff, his mind racing. Clint looked up as Jack approached, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Jack felt the weight of the silence between them, thick with unspoken words. "Clint," Jack said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I think we need to talk." Clint raised an eyebrow, a small, almost amused smile playing at the corners of his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just gestured for Jack to sit. The invitation was casual, unassuming, but Jack could sense the weight of it. This wasn't just a simple conversation. This was the moment when everything would either stay the same or change forever. Jack took a seat across from Clint, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea where this conversation was going, but he knew he couldn't back down now. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jack began, his words slow and deliberate. "You know, about how I don't know what it's like to feel invisible. And I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe I've been looking at everything the wrong way." Clint didn't say anything. He just listened, his expression unreadable, but there was a hint of something in his eyes, curiosity, maybe, or something else. Jack wasn't sure. But he pressed on. "I've been so focused on how unfair everything is. My job, my life, all the crap I have to deal with every day. I've just been angry. And I guess I thought that if I kept pushing back, if I kept fighting against it all, it would make everything better. Clint's eyes softened, and for the first time since Jack had known him, Clint spoke, his voice low and steady. Fighting can be important, Clint said, his gaze steady. But it's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes, the real fight is learning when to stop and listen. When to see things for what they are, instead of how you wish they would be. Jack stared at Clint, trying to process the words. For the first time, he realized that Clint wasn't just giving him advice. He was speaking from experience. This wasn't the voice of someone who had everything handed to them. This was the voice of someone who had lived through hardship, who had fought battles of his own and learned the hardest lessons. I don't know if I understand everything yet, Jack admitted, his voice quieter now. But maybe I'm starting to see it. I've been so caught up in my own head, in my own anger, that I never stopped to think about what I was doing to myself, or to others. Clint nodded slowly, as if he had expected Jack to come to this realization. That's the first step, Jack. Admitting it. Understanding it. And then, if you're lucky, finding a way to change it. Jack sat back in his chair, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a direction. Like there was a way out of the anger, the resentment, the cycle of frustration that had held him captive for so long. The next few days after that conversation with Clint felt like a turning point for Jack. It wasn't an overnight change, not by any means. But there was something different in the air, something heavier, yet lighter at the same time. It was like Jack was walking around with new eyes, seeing the world, and even himself, in a way he never had before. He spent the next few shifts reflecting on everything Clint had said. The conversation echoed in his head constantly. It was as though Clint's words had planted a seed deep inside Jack, one that was beginning to take root and grow. But there was still a lot Jack didn't understand. He had come to realize that his anger and bitterness had been his shield, his armor against the world that always seemed to keep him at arm's length. But could he really let that go? Could he allow himself to be vulnerable enough to let someone else in? The question gnawed at him. It was late one evening when everything finally came to a head. Jack was working the night shift again, clearing glasses and wiping down the counters, when Clint appeared once more. He walked in with his usual air of quiet confidence, but this time there was something different in his demeanor. He wasn't just a man enjoying his drink, he seemed like someone who had come to make a statement, someone who was ready for a change of their own. Jack felt the tension in the air before Clint even spoke. Jack, Clint greeted him as he approached the bar, his voice steady but with a hint of something unfamiliar. I think it's time we talked again. Clint's words hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and Jack could feel a knot tightening in his chest. He had been expecting this conversation for days, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure he was ready. He wasn't sure he was worthy of it. What do you mean? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Clint looked at him carefully, his eyes piercing, but kind. I'm not just some rich guy here to teach you a lesson, Jack. I've seen a lot in my life, been through a lot of my own struggles. I think you deserve to know the truth. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The truth. He had no idea where this conversation was headed, but the gravity of Clint's words felt like a weight on his chest. You see, I know what it's like to feel invisible, Clint continued, his voice taking on a different tone. But there's more to it than just being overlooked or ignored. Sometimes, it's about feeling like everything you've worked for doesn't matter, or that nothing in your life can ever measure up to what you think it should be. Jack's mind raced, trying to keep up with Clint's words. He had always assumed that Clint's life had been easy, that his wealth, fame, and success had come without struggle. But now, sitting there, Jack realized that Clint wasn't just the man he had built him up to be in his mind. He wasn't the arrogant figure he had assumed. Clint was someone who had fought battles of his own, battles Jack couldn't even imagine. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but Clint raised a hand to stop him. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this, Clint said with a sigh, leaning back in his chair. The truth is, I've spent most of my life trying to escape my past, trying to prove to myself and to others that I was more than just a product of my circumstances. But the truth? I never really confronted who I was or what I was running from. And I see that same fear in you, Jack. That fear of being stuck. Of never moving forward. Jack felt the sting of Clint's words hit harder than he expected. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had always believed that Clint's life was a picture-perfect image of success, a life where everything was easy because of his wealth and fame. But what Clint had just shared shattered that illusion. Clint had struggled, too. And that realization hit Jack like a tidal wave. I didn't expect to hear that, Jack muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. I thought you had it all figured out. I thought you were just some rich guy who had everything handed to him. Clint let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Trust me, Jack, nothing is ever as simple as it seems on the surface. We all carry our own baggage, even the ones who look like they've got it all together. I've had to face some tough truths about myself, and it hasn't been easy. But those truths? They're the only thing that can set you free. For the first time, Jack saw Clint Eastwood in a new light. He wasn't just the gruff man with the stiff demeanor, he was someone who had endured, someone who had struggled through his own personal hell. He wasn't perfect, and maybe, just maybe, he had something to teach Jack after all. I don't know if I can do that, Jack said quietly, staring at the glass in front of him. I don't know if I can change. I've been angry for so long. I've built this wall around me. How do you just tear it down and start over? Clint leaned forward, his gaze softening. You don't have to tear it all down at once, Jack. Change doesn't happen overnight. But the first step? It's knowing you can. You can change. You can choose to face the truth about yourself, even if it scares the hell out of you. Jack sat back, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't stuck. The world wasn't trapping him in a corner. It was his own fear, his own choices, that had kept him in place. And now, Clint was giving him the tools to break free. But before Jack could say anything else, Clint placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, but kind. Just remember, Jack, Clint said, his voice a low rumble, the biggest battles are often the ones we fight inside ourselves. And the only way to win is by accepting that we have the power to change. That's the truth I've learned. Jack nodded slowly, a new sense of understanding washing over him. Maybe, just maybe, Clint was right. Maybe the only thing standing between him and the life he wanted was his own willingness to let go of the past. The days that followed that conversation with Clint were some of the most challenging and transformative of Jack's life. His mind was still buzzing with everything Clint had revealed, but now, instead of fighting it, Jack found himself leaning into the discomfort. It wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth. But for the first time, Jack felt like he had a glimpse of something better, something beyond the cycle of anger and resentment he had lived in for so long. Jack didn't just go through the motions anymore. His shifts at the hotel felt different. There was a new sense of purpose behind his work, a quiet resolve that came from within. The customers he had once viewed as faceless, annoying, or entitled began to seem different too, just people, all with their own stories, their own struggles. He started to listen more closely, observe the little things, and even the smallest interactions seemed to carry a deeper meaning. And it wasn't just the guests he had to think about, it was himself. The next time Clint came into the bar, Jack was ready, not to lash out, not to resent him, but to engage with him, to understand him more. He wasn't sure where this new dynamic was taking them, but there was something there, something deeper than either of them had anticipated. Clint, Jack greeted him, a more genuine smile on his face than he had shown in weeks. How's it going today? Clint smiled back, the kind of smile that didn't just show on his face, but in his eyes too. It's going well, Jack. Better than I thought it would be. The words were simple, but there was an honesty to them that Jack hadn't fully grasped until now. It wasn't that Clint had it all figured out, it was that Clint had come to accept that life was a process. There was no perfection, no final destination. Just small steps, moment by moment. "You've been quiet lately," Jack remarked, refilling Clint's drink as he sat down at his usual spot at the bar. "What's on your mind?" Clint took a sip of his drink, his gaze thoughtful. "A lot, actually," he said, looking down at the glass in his hand. "But I've realized that I don't need to have all the answers anymore. I don't need to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders." Jack nodded, absorbing Clint's words. It was a humbling thing to hear. Clint Eastwood, one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood, admitting that he didn't have all the answers. That he had accepted the fact that life didn't come with a manual, and that sometimes, it was okay to just go with the flow. "I used to think I had to be perfect," Clint continued, his voice a little quieter now. "That I had to be this larger-than-life figure for people to respect me. But I've come to learn that perfection doesn't exist. What matters is the journey. What matters is how you treat people along the way." Jack's mind raced. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood he had known, the tough, no-nonsense actor who seemed untouchable. This Clint was different. More human. More real. And in that moment, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude for Clint's honesty, for showing him that it was okay to not have it all figured out. "I think I get it now," Jack said after a long pause. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove something to everyone, including myself. I thought if I was angry enough, if I worked hard enough, it would all just click into place. But it's not about the destination, is it? It's about the moments, the choices we make every single day." Clint smiled softly. "Exactly. It's about learning to live with the uncertainty, with the things you can't control, and making peace with that." Jack sat back, absorbing those words, feeling the weight of them settle over him. This wasn't just a conversation about career success or fame, it was about life. About being human. About being okay with who you were, flaws and all. It was about accepting that you didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of respect, of love, of happiness. He realized, in that moment, that Clint had given him more than advice. He had given him a new perspective. And that perspective was freeing. "Thank you, Clint," Jack said quietly. "I don't think I could have learned this from anyone else. Not like this." Clint gave him a knowing look. "You'll get there, Jack. It's not about finding some magical answer, it's about finding peace with who you are right now. Not who you were, or who you're trying to be, but who you are in this moment. You've got a lot more strength than you realize." As Jack listened to Clint's words, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had spent so much of his life in a constant battle, pushing himself harder and harder, striving for something he wasn't even sure he wanted. But now, he understood that true strength wasn't about fighting all the time. It was about knowing when to let go, when to forgive himself, and when to embrace the imperfection of life. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. Jack knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. He still had moments of doubt, moments where the old anger would flare up again. But now, when that happened, he would have a new tool to cope with it. The truth. The acceptance. The understanding that he didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. And that was enough. Jack walked out of the hotel that night with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't sure where his journey was taking him, but he knew that he was no longer trapped. He had the power to make choices, to move forward, and to embrace the uncertainty that life threw at him. As he stepped into the cool night air, Jack looked up at the stars above him. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Jack couldn't quite shake the events of the night before. Despite feeling proud of himself for handling the confrontation in a way that was calm and controlled, there was a part of him that still felt unsettled. It was as if, despite his growth, the world around him kept pushing him, testing him, trying to drag him back into the person he used to be. That following week, Jack's shifts at the hotel carried on like they always had. He kept his head down, doing his work with a quiet determination. The guests came and went, some courteous, others not so much. But Jack was no longer reactive. He had Clint's words constantly in the back of his mind: choose peace. Choose the moment. However, Jack's quiet resolve would soon be put to the test again, in a way he didn't expect. And this time, the challenge wasn't just a rude guest or a frustrating shift. It was something deeper, something far more personal. One quiet morning, as Jack was wiping down the bar, a figure walked into the hotel's lobby. She was tall, with bright red hair that caught the sunlight as it streamed in through the glass doors. She wore a smart, professional-looking suit, though there was an aura of anxiety around her body language stiff, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jack noticed her immediately. Something about her presence felt different. She walked up to the front desk where Emily, one of the hotel's receptionists, greeted her with a smile. After a few brief exchanges, the woman turned and made her way to the bar, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "Hey," she called out when she reached Jack. "Can I get a coffee, Black?" Jack nodded and began preparing her order, but he could tell she was still tense. There was something about her that seemed off. The kind of tension that someone couldn't quite shake no matter how hard they tried. "Everything okay?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. The words were a bit automatic. He wasn't used to opening up to strangers, but he felt a nudge, a curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that, like him, she seemed to be carrying something heavy. She hesitated for a moment, and then, almost as if she had decided to let her guard down, she spoke. "You know, it's funny," she said, staring at the counter as if the coffee was the most important thing in the world. "I've spent the last few months running away from everything I should have faced." Jack set the coffee down in front of her and raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I'm a financial analyst. I was part of a corporate team that had a massive deal fall through, big loss. And the thing is, I was supposed to be the one to fix it. But I didn't. I couldn't. Now, I'm here trying to. I don't know. Maybe hide from it all. Or find a way to fix the mess I've made." Jack felt a strange connection to her words. He'd been there. Maybe not with the same exact situation, but the feeling of failure, of knowing you didn't live up to expectations, he knew that. He had lived with it for years. "You're not alone," Jack said, his voice softer than he intended. He hadn't meant to share so much, but something about the woman's vulnerability made him feel like he wasn't the only one who had spent years running from something. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand if he really meant it. She must have seen something in him because her expression softened. "I don't even know why I'm telling you all this," she said, laughing nervously. I've been trying so hard to fix everything, and I've failed. I thought maybe a change of scenery would help, but I can't even get my mind to stop spinning." Jack leaned against the counter, his mind whirring. He could hear the hurt and frustration in her voice, the same tone that had defined so many of his own days. But there was something else too, something he wasn't used to. Empathy. He felt a pull to help her, as if it was time for him to stop focusing only on his own struggles and start reaching out to others. "I get it," Jack said. "I've been running from my own stuff for years. Trying to fix it, trying to be someone I wasn't. It takes a toll on you, doesn't it?" She looked at him, genuinely surprised. "You've been through something like that?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. But the thing is, at some point, you realize you can't fix everything. You can't fix all the mistakes. But you can start by accepting them, by facing them head-on. And sometimes, that's where the real change happens." The woman seemed to think about that for a moment. Then, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Maybe I'm not the only one who needs to face some things. Thanks. I don't know why, but I feel better talking about it. Jack gave her a simple, reassuring smile. Sometimes, we all need to talk it out. Even if it's just with a stranger. She finished her coffee, standing to leave, but before she walked away, she turned to Jack one last time. You're right, she said. Maybe it's time I start facing things head-on, too. Jack watched her walk out of the hotel, feeling a strange sense of peace. He had helped someone today, in a way that was unexpected. He had been able to connect, to show empathy, and in doing so, had found a bit of healing for himself too. It was small, just a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered. Jack realized that, just like Clint had helped him with his own journey, maybe he could help others along the way. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures or fixing everything in one go. Maybe it was about the small acts of kindness, the moments where you chose to be open, to be present, and to offer someone a bit of understanding. And that realization felt like another small step forward. The following days after his conversation with the woman had left Jack in a reflective mood. He wasn't used to feeling so connected to other people. He had spent years living within his own bubble of frustration and self-doubt, but now he was starting to understand the value of human connection in a way that went beyond just doing his job. It was as if something inside him had shifted, like a door had opened just enough for him to peer into a world he had been blind to for so long. But the road to change was rarely a straight path. Despite his growing self-awareness, Jack still had moments when the weight of his old habits would try to drag him back down. There were mornings when he would wake up, look in the mirror, and wonder if he was really any different. Would he fall back into the same patterns? Could he really change, or was this just another fleeting attempt at self-improvement? It wasn't until the next weekend that Jack was forced to confront these doubts head-on. The hotel was unusually busy for a Saturday night. A large corporate group had booked the entire penthouse suite for a private event, and the lobby was flooded with well-dressed guests, talking and laughing with glasses in hand. Jack had been running around all night, serving drinks, keeping track of orders, and making sure everything went smoothly. But his feet ached, his patience was thinning, and his mind was starting to feel foggy. It was during one of these chaotic moments that a familiar face appeared. Jack, Clint called from across the bar, his voice cutting through the noise. Can I talk to you for a minute? Jack wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to where Clint was standing, his calm presence like an anchor amidst the storm of the hotel's busy atmosphere. Clint was leaning against the counter, his usual composed self, but there was something about his demeanor today that felt different. He looked serious. Everything all right? Jack asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Clint hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod. Yeah, but I've been watching you these past few days, and I think it's time we have a talk. Jack's stomach tightened at the words. Was he about to get another lesson, another lecture on how to improve? It felt like there was always something more Jack needed to do to reach that ideal version of himself Clint seemed to see in him. You're doing well, Clint said, noticing the anxiety flicker across Jack's face. But there's something I've noticed. You're still holding on to the past, Jack. You can't move forward until you let go of it. Jack's chest tightened. What do you mean? He didn't feel like he was holding on to anything, but deep down, he knew there were unresolved issues still festering inside him. I see it in your eyes, Clint said, his gaze steady and unflinching. Every now and then, you slip back into the old Jack. The one who snaps at people. The one who hides behind his anger. You're doing the work, but you haven't done the hardest part yet. You need to forgive yourself. Jack felt his heart race. Forgiveness? That word sounded foreign, almost impossible to him. He had spent so much time blaming the world, blaming others for the way his life had turned out. To forgive himself would mean acknowledging that, in some ways, he had played a part in his own downfall. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face that. I'm trying, Jack said, though the words felt hollow, as if he were trying to convince himself more than Clint. Clint nodded, understanding. I get it. It's not easy. But if you don't forgive yourself, you'll never be able to move forward. You'll always be stuck in that cycle of anger and regret. Jack swallowed hard, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. He had never really thought about it that way. He had spent so much time focusing on his external circumstances, his boss, his broken relationships, his failures, that he hadn't stopped to ask himself if he was holding on to something inside. Maybe he was still punishing himself for his mistakes, for the things he could never take back. Do you think I can really change? Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question he had been asking himself in the quiet moments, but hearing it out loud felt different. Clint smiled, a slight, knowing smile. I wouldn't be here talking to you if I didn't think you could. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The clinking of glasses, the chatter of guests, the sound of plates being cleared, everything felt like it was happening in the background, as if the world around them had faded away. In that stillness, Jack understood something profound. The only way to truly change, to step into the person he wanted to be, was to let go of the past and the guilt he had carried with him for so long. All right, Jack said finally, his voice steadier now. I'm ready. I'm going to try. Clint placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. That's all any of us can do, Jack. Just try. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. With that, Clint turned and made his way back to his usual seat. Jack stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of the conversation settle. He was still unsure of what the future held, still uncertain if he could fully let go of everything that haunted him. But for the first time, he felt like he had the tools to try. As the night went on and Jack moved through the bar, serving drinks and making small talk with the guests, he began to feel a shift within himself. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity where everything fell into place. But it was a start. He was letting go of the anger. He was forgiving himself, piece by piece. And that, he realized, was the real turning point. Jack hadn't realized how long he'd been carrying the weight of his past until Clint's words had forced him to face it. The next few days were full of introspection, as Jack tried to come to terms with the reality that he had been running from his own regrets for far too long. The hotel's bustling atmosphere continued to be a backdrop to his journey of self-discovery, but the deeper struggle was happening quietly within him. He spent hours reflecting on the things he had never allowed himself to process, the betrayals, the mistakes, the relationships he had neglected or sabotaged. He had always been so focused on what was wrong with the world around him, he hadn't stopped to consider that maybe the world wasn't the problem. Maybe it was him, holding on to all the anger, resentment, and guilt. One late evening, Jack found himself sitting alone in the hotel's break room after his shift had ended. The sounds of the lobby seemed so far away, and the only light in the room was from the faint glow of the vending machine in the corner. Jack stared at his reflection in the window, the dim lights catching his tired eyes. He had been running from himself for years, thinking that he could outrun his past, but Clint had made him realize something: you can't outrun your own reflection. The problem wasn't just about the hotel or the people around him, it was about the way he saw himself. Jack had never fully forgiven himself for his past mistakes, and it had shaped every decision he'd made. He had buried his feelings so deep that even he had forgotten what it felt like to acknowledge them. But now, it was time to face those feelings head-on. Clint's words echoed in his mind: you can't move forward until you let go. It wasn't just about forgiving others. It was about forgiving himself. And Jack knew, deep down, that the only way he could truly change, truly find peace, was to make peace with the person he had been. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was terrifying. But for the first time in his life, Jack knew that the path to healing would require vulnerability. He couldn't fix everything all at once, but he could start by taking small steps toward self-acceptance. The following day, as the sun began to set, Jack found himself walking outside the hotel to get some fresh air. The cool evening breeze felt grounding against his skin. He leaned against the stone railing, looking out at the horizon, trying to clear his mind. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the past. One particular memory stood out, the argument with his father. It was one of those arguments that had left deep scars, both for him and his father. It had happened years ago, before Jack had even left for college. His father had been disappointed in him, angry at the choices Jack had made. And Jack, feeling misunderstood, had fired back with bitterness, saying things he couldn't take back. It had been the breaking point of their relationship. Jack hadn't spoken to his father since. It was a painful memory, one he had tucked away in the recesses of his mind. But standing there in the fading light of the evening, Jack felt something stir inside him. Maybe it was time to confront that ghost. Maybe it was time to make amends. It wasn't about fixing everything, it was about trying. He took out his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he found his father's contact. He hadn't dialed the number in years. But now, with his heart pounding in his chest, Jack pressed call. The phone rang, and Jack's stomach twisted with each passing second. Finally, the voice on the other end picked up. "Hello," his father's voice said, older but still familiar. "Dad?" Jack's voice caught in his throat. It was as though the years of silence had built a wall between them, and now it was crumbling. "Jack? Is that you?" His father's tone was cautious, unsure. "Yeah, it's me." Jack paused, trying to find the right words. I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us. And I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for the things I said, for the way I treated you." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Jack thought his father might hang up. But then, his father's voice came through, softer than Jack remembered. "I'm sorry too, son. I know we've both carried a lot of weight from that day. I never wanted to push you away. I just didn't understand." "I didn't understand either," Jack admitted, his voice breaking. "But I'm trying to now. I'm trying to be better." "I know you are," his father replied, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a genuine sense of relief. They didn't say much more, but the conversation was enough. It was the first step toward healing, not just for Jack, but for both of them. As he hung up the phone, Jack felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't the end of the journey, there was still so much to work through, but it was a beginning. A beginning where Jack could finally start moving forward, no longer tethered to the mistakes of his past. That night, as Jack walked back into the hotel, he realized that he had just taken one of the hardest steps of his life. He had faced his demons, and for the first time, he had chosen to forgive himself. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Jack knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more struggles, more obstacles, but he was no longer afraid to face them. Because he had learned the most important lesson of all, change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something you chose every day. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing to move forward with it. Sometimes, the hardest thing is to forgive yourself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Jack's reconciliation with his father were a whirlwind of emotions. Jack felt lighter, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. But as with all journeys of self-discovery, the path forward wasn't smooth. There were still moments of doubt, of frustration, and of wondering if he had made any real progress at all. It had been weeks since his heart-to-heart with Clint, and the changes in Jack were subtle but undeniable. He found himself less quick to anger, more patient with his colleagues, and even more thoughtful in his interactions with customers. But just when he thought he was making strides, the universe seemed to throw a curveball his way, a test of his resolve. It all started on a Thursday evening. The hotel was busier than usual. The weekend rush had arrived early, and the bar was packed with guests and regulars. Jack had just finished delivering a round of drinks to a corporate party when a sudden commotion broke out near the entrance. He glanced over, his heart sinking when he saw a familiar face, a guest he hadn't seen in a while. The man was tall, dressed in an expensive suit, his hair meticulously styled. Jack recognized him instantly as Richard Collier, a wealthy businessman who had stayed at the hotel a few months ago. Richard was known for his sharp tongue and arrogant demeanor, and for Jack, he represented everything that had once angered him about the world. Arrogant, entitled people who thought they could walk over others without consequence. But tonight was different. Richard wasn't just being his usual condescending self. He was shouting at one of the newer waiters, a young man named Alex, who had only started working at the hotel a few weeks ago. Jack could hear snippets of their exchange from across the room. "Are you blind?" Richard's voice rang out, cutting through the chatter. "I ordered my drink 20 minutes ago. You call this service?" Alex stood there, frozen in place, his face pale. He wasn't used to confrontation like this, and the stress of the job was clearly getting to him. Jack's instincts kicked in. He knew he couldn't let Richard get away with this, no matter how much the man's wealth and status seemed to give him the upper hand. Jack walked over to the scene, trying to keep his composure. The bar was quieter now, everyone watching the interaction like it was a showdown. The tension was thick, and Jack could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. They were all waiting to see what he would do. "Richard," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Richard turned to him, his face a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Oh, it's you. This waiter," he motioned to Alex, "has been rude and incompetent. I've been waiting for my drink forever." Jack took a deep breath, maintaining eye contact with Richard. "You're being unfair," he said, his tone steady. "Alex is new here. Mistakes happen. There's no need to shout." Richard scoffed, not at all intimidated by Jack's calm demeanor. "Mistakes happen. I don't pay for mistakes. I pay for service. And frankly, I'm not interested in excuses." Jack's pulse quickened. He had to control himself. He couldn't let Richard's attitude get to him, not after everything he had learned. But it was hard. Richard's words felt like a direct attack, a reminder of the kind of person Jack used to be, the kind who demanded perfection and showed no patience for those who couldn't meet his standards. But this time, Jack didn't snap. He didn't let his anger take control. Instead, he addressed Richard with the same level-headedness he had learned to cultivate. "You're absolutely right that we aim for the best service here. But no one deserves to be treated like that. And I think you owe Alex an apology." For a moment, there was silence. Richard stared at Jack as if trying to gauge whether or not he was serious. The crowd that had gathered around the scene seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next move. Jack stood his ground, refusing to back down. He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Alex, it was about him. It was about showing that he had changed, that he had learned something from the lessons Clint had taught him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard's eyes flickered with frustration. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, likely another insult, but before he could, Jack spoke again. "I'll take care of your drink," Jack said, turning toward Alex. "You don't have to worry about him anymore. I'll handle this." Richard narrowed his eyes but seemed to accept Jack's words. With a huff, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He glanced at Alex, who still looked shaken but relieved. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. Alex nodded, though he still looked a little pale. "Thanks, Jack. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it. That guy's just a bully. Don't let him get to you." The rest of the night passed without incident, but Jack couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation with Richard. As he cleaned up the bar at the end of his shift, he realized just how much his response had changed from the way he would have handled it in the past. There was no shouting, no anger, no desire to prove himself right. Instead, he had simply stood up for what was right, for the person who needed support. It wasn't about winning the fight, it was about showing kindness and respect, even to people who didn't deserve it. For Jack, this moment was another step in the right direction. A test of his patience, a test of his resolve. And, in the end, he had passed it. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Jack's past came knocking in a way he wasn't prepared for. The hotel was unusually calm, with only a handful of guests checking in and out. Jack had just finished his shift in the dining room and was about to grab a quick lunch before heading out to meet Clint for one of their usual heart-to-hearts when the front desk attendant, Sarah, called out to him. "Hey, Jack, there's someone here to see you," she said with a puzzled expression on her face. "They said it's urgent." Jack furrowed his brow. Urgent? His mind raced through all the possibilities, wondering who could possibly need him right now. The last person he expected to see was someone from his past. But that's exactly who was standing in the lobby, waiting for him. Jack. The voice was familiar, but it had been years since he'd heard it. Jack turned to face the person calling his name. Standing there, with an almost sheepish expression, was Lucy, the woman he had once been in love with, the woman who had left him without a word after their turbulent relationship had collapsed. The woman whose absence had left a hole in his heart for years. For a moment, Jack couldn't speak. He stood frozen in the lobby, staring at Lucy as she awkwardly shifted from one foot to the other. Her long brown hair was now tied in a sleek ponytail, and she was dressed in a business suit, looking as polished and composed as ever. But Jack could see it in her eyes, the same uncertainty, the same vulnerability that had been there when they were younger. She hadn't changed, not really. "Lucy," Jack finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It felt surreal to see her again after all this time. He had buried the memories of their relationship deep inside, telling himself that he had moved on. But now, standing in front of him, Lucy had stirred up all the emotions he thought he had left behind. She offered a tight smile. "I know it's been a while. I didn't know where else to go." Jack took a step forward, still processing the moment. "What are you doing here? Why now?" Lucy hesitated before speaking. I need your help, Jack. I've made some mistakes, and I don't know who else to turn to." Jack felt a rush of emotions flood through him, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. The last time they had spoken, Lucy had walked out of his life without any explanation. He had begged her to stay, but she had been determined to leave, convinced that their relationship was doomed from the start. Jack had spent years trying to understand why it had ended so abruptly, why she had chosen to walk away without a single word of closure. And now, here she was, standing in front of him, asking for help. "Help?" Jack repeated, his voice rising despite his attempt to remain calm. "You disappeared without a trace, Lucy. I didn't hear from you for years, and now you just show up and expect me to drop everything and help you?" Lucy looked down at the floor, guilt written all over her face. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but I was wrong." Jack's anger simmered, but he tried to control it. He had learned a lot in the past few months about dealing with his emotions, about understanding that lashing out wasn't the answer. Still, the hurt was fresh, the wound still raw. "Then why are you here, Lucy?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "After everything that happened, why come to me now?" Lucy's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was no mask, no pretenses. It was just the two of them, standing in the lobby of the hotel, with years of history between them. "I need your help with my business," she said, her voice cracking. "I've gotten into some financial trouble, and I don't know where else to turn. I've been trying to fix it myself, but it's gotten too complicated. I need someone I can trust." Jack blinked, taken aback by her words. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated an apology, maybe an explanation for why she had left him all those years ago. But now, she was asking for his help, the same man she had walked away from without a second thought. For a moment, Jack stood there in silence, his mind racing. He had every right to turn her away, to tell her that he had moved on and didn't need to be dragged back into her mess. But at the same time, there was a part of him that wanted to help her. The same part of him that had loved her once, deeply and passionately, despite everything that had happened. "I don't know if I can help you, Lucy," Jack said slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. "You hurt me. You left without any explanation, and I had to pick up the pieces of my life. It's not easy to just forget that." Lucy nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I know. And I'm not asking for you to forget. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. I've spent so many years regretting what happened between us. I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. But now, I need your help. I don't know who else to turn to." Jack looked at her, his heart torn between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. He wasn't the same man who had been left behind all those years ago. He had changed, learned, and grown. But could he find it in himself to help her, despite everything? After a long pause, Jack let out a sigh. "I don't know if I can fix what happened between us, but I'll help you with your business. That's all I can offer right now." Lucy's face softened with gratitude, and for the first time in years, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Jack. I promise I won't take up any more of your time. I just need this chance." Jack nodded, his decision made. It wasn't about rekindling their past. It was about doing the right thing now, for the person she had become. "Let's talk details," he said, his voice steady. "But we do this on my terms." As they walked toward the back office, Jack couldn't help but wonder if this unexpected encounter with Lucy was another step in his journey of healing. There were still unresolved feelings, but he knew that in this moment, he was strong enough to face them head-on, without letting them control him. It had been a week since Lucy's unexpected visit to the hotel, and Jack had kept his promise. He had helped her with her business issues. It wasn't easy. There were phone calls to make, meetings to schedule, and, above all, a constant nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. Every time he spoke to Lucy, it felt like a part of him wanted to slide back into old patterns, the patterns of anger, distrust, and unresolved feelings. The truth was, Jack hadn't completely moved on. He couldn't deny that a part of him was still hurt, still angry at Lucy for how things had ended between them. But there was another part of him, the part that had grown and changed over the past few months, that kept reminding him of the lessons he'd learned from Clint and his own journey of self-discovery. He couldn't let those old wounds control him. Not anymore. But that didn't mean it was easy. Jack sat at the bar one late afternoon, nursing a drink after a long day. The hotel was relatively quiet, with only a few guests trickling in. He wasn't scheduled to work, but Clint had invited him to meet up for a casual drink, and Jack had agreed. He hadn't seen Clint in a few days, and he knew that his friend would always have a perspective on things that might help him navigate these emotional hurdles. Clint walked in a few minutes later, his usual easy smile lighting up his face. He waved as he approached the bar and took a seat next to Jack. "Hey, buddy. How's it going?" Clint asked, leaning back in his chair. Jack gave a half-smile. Same old, same old. You know, just trying to figure things out." Clint chuckled. "I hear you. Life's never really as simple as we want it to be, is it?" "No," Jack replied, swirling his drink in his glass. "I've been helping Lucy with some of her business stuff. It's been tough. I mean, it's hard to let go of the past. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Clint's expression shifted from casual to thoughtful. You're doing the right thing, Jack. Helping her, I mean. But I think you're still holding on to a lot. You've been through a lot together, and it's going to take time to let go of all that baggage. It's okay to not have it all figured out right now. Jack nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He had always prided himself on being in control of his emotions, his actions. And yet, here he was, still carrying around the weight of his past with Lucy, unsure how to move forward. I don't know if I can just let go of all the anger, Jack admitted. Every time I see her, I feel like I'm slipping back into the same old patterns. I want to help her, but at the same time, I want to tell her off for all the things she did to me. Clint leaned forward, his gaze intense. Look, Jack, it's normal to feel that way. But here's the thing, you can't let her have that power over you anymore. The anger, the resentment, it's only hurting you. It's not about forgiving her for what she did. It's about setting yourself free. Jack thought about Clint's words for a moment, trying to wrap his mind around them. It was hard, really hard, to let go of the anger that had festered for so many years. But Clint was right. As much as he hated to admit it, Jack realized that holding on to that resentment was only keeping him stuck in the past. I just don't know how to stop feeling the way I feel, Jack confessed. Clint smiled knowingly. You don't have to do it all at once, Jack. Take it one day at a time. Focus on the present. You're helping Lucy because it's the right thing to do, not because you owe her anything. And, in time, you'll start to see that you're doing this for you, not for her. Jack's mind was swirling with conflicting thoughts. He wanted to believe Clint. He wanted to believe that he could let go of the past and stop letting old habits define his actions. But it wasn't that simple. The pain was still there, and it felt like it would take forever to work through it. Maybe you're right, Jack said quietly. But I still don't know if I can trust myself to not slip back into my old ways. Clint raised an eyebrow. Old ways? What do you mean? Jack paused before answering. You know, getting angry, shutting people out, taking things too personally. I've done that for so long, it's almost like second nature. I'm not sure I know how to change that. Clint leaned back, thinking for a moment. Well, here's the thing. You don't have to completely erase your past, Jack. Those old habits, those reflexes, they're part of you. But you're not the same person anymore. The fact that you're even asking these questions means you've already started changing. Jack wasn't sure he completely believed it yet, but Clint's words had a calming effect on him. Maybe it was true. Maybe change didn't have to happen all at once. Maybe it was about making small choices every day, every moment, to move forward. Thanks, Clint, Jack said, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. I think I needed to hear that. Clint smiled. Anytime, man. That's what friends are for. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself lost in thought. He hadn't realized how much weight he had been carrying around, until Clint had pointed it out. The anger, the hurt, the old ways of dealing with things, they had all been keeping him from moving forward. But now, as he looked at the situation with new eyes, he could see the path ahead more clearly. Jack wasn't perfect. He still had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making progress. The old habits weren't gone, but he had learned how to recognize them, how to catch himself before he slipped back into them. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As he finished his drink and stood up to leave, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't an all-encompassing peace, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. The next few days were a whirlwind of events. Jack had managed to keep his emotions in check, focusing on his work at the hotel and maintaining his composure in front of Lucy. He had helped her, given her advice, and even offered a few business connections that might help get her back on track. But despite his efforts, there was a feeling of unease gnawing at him. Every time Lucy smiled at him with gratitude or asked for his guidance, Jack felt a tug in his chest, a mix of old affection and simmering resentment. He was doing the right thing, helping her because it was the honorable choice. Yet, with each passing day, the weight of their past seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on his chest. It was hard to ignore the gnawing feeling that perhaps he had been too eager to offer his assistance, that he was still caught in the web of emotions he had never fully unraveled. It was an evening like any other when the tension finally broke. Jack had been standing behind the bar, wiping down glasses when Sarah, the front desk attendant, called out to him with urgency. "Jack, there's someone here to see you," Sarah said, a little flustered. "They're asking for you by name." Jack's stomach turned. He thought it might be another issue with one of the guests, perhaps a problem with a room or a billing mistake. But when he stepped into the lobby, his breath caught in his throat. Standing there, looking a little out of place in his designer suit, was none other than Gavin, Lucy's ex-husband. Jack had never liked Gavin. The man had always rubbed him the wrong way, with his sharp tongue and slick demeanor. But what bothered Jack more than anything was that Lucy had once been married to him. Gavin had been the kind of guy who always seemed to have an answer for everything, but it was clear to Jack that he never truly cared about Lucy the way she deserved to be cared for. "What are you doing here, Gavin?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he crossed the lobby. His fists were clenched, but he knew he needed to remain calm. If there was one thing he had learned over the past few months, it was that reacting impulsively wasn't going to get him anywhere. Gavin smirked, leaning against the front desk as he shot Jack an almost dismissive look. "Nice to see you too, Jack. I heard you've been playing the Good Samaritan with my ex-wife. How noble of you." Jack's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Gavin's eyes gleamed with a cold amusement. "I want to know what you think you're doing, Jack. You think you can just waltz in and fix everything for her? You think she's changed? You don't know her like I do." Jack resisted the urge to step forward and throw a punch. He knew that would only escalate things. "Lucy's made her own choices, Gavin. I'm just here to help her out. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with her." "Oh, I will," Gavin replied with a smug grin. "But don't fool yourself into thinking you're helping her. You're not doing her any favors by keeping her on a pedestal, Jack. She's still the same woman who ran from her responsibilities when it suited her." The words hit Jack like a slap in the face. He could feel his anger bubbling to the surface again. Was this all just a game to Gavin? Had he not learned anything from his own mistakes, from his own broken marriage? Did he really think he could come in here and dictate what was best for Lucy? Jack opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Lucy appeared from the hallway, walking into the lobby with a calm, composed expression on her face. She froze when she saw Gavin, and the air seemed to shift, the tension in the room palpable. "Gavin," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of hesitation. "What are you doing here?" Gavin smiled as if he had just won a victory. "I was hoping to have a little chat with you, Lucy. I think it's time we discussed some of your choices, don't you?" Jack felt the anger welling up in him again, but he didn't want to make a scene. He had spent the past few days trying to hold his ground, trying to help Lucy without getting involved in the drama. But now, it was all coming to a head, and he could feel himself starting to unravel. "Lucy, you don't have to listen to him," Jack said, his voice firm but strained. "You've made your decisions. You don't owe him anything." Lucy's eyes flickered between Jack and Gavin, her face a mixture of emotions. Jack could see the confusion in her eyes, the remnants of old wounds that still hadn't healed. And yet, despite everything that had happened between them, she still cared. Jack could tell that much. "I'm not here to fight with you, Jack," Gavin said, his tone suddenly cold. "I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions. You can't just sweep everything under the rug." Lucy took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she turned to Jack. "I didn't ask for this, Jack. I didn't ask for him to come here. Jack's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He could see now that this wasn't about him. It was about her, and the lingering ghosts of her past that she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried. I know you didn't, Lucy, Jack said quietly, stepping closer to her. But I'm here for you. You don't have to face this alone. Gavin snorted derisively. So, what's your plan, Jack? You think you can be her knight in shining armor and fix everything? You think you can just erase the past? The word stung, but Jack held his ground. He wasn't here to erase the past. He was here to help Lucy move forward. She didn't need a knight, she needed someone who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to live with the past. Lucy placed a hand on Jack's arm, her touch soft but grounding. I don't want to fight, Gavin. I just want to move on with my life. Can't you respect that? Gavin's face twisted in frustration. You're delusional if you think you can escape your past. You'll always be the same person you were. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let Gavin's words shake him. Maybe we all are, Jack said, his voice steady. But that doesn't mean we can't change. And Lucy's doing just that. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jack stood firm. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about helping Lucy, it was about helping himself. It was about learning to forgive, not just her, but also himself. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to move forward. Gavin's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before he scoffed and turned toward the door. This isn't over, Lucy, he muttered as he walked away. As soon as he left, the weight in the room lifted. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lucy turned to him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Thank you, Jack, she said quietly. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jack smiled softly. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're not facing this alone. For the first time in days, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had helped Lucy confront a part of her past that she had been avoiding, and in doing so, he had faced his own. But there was still a long road ahead, one that would take time and patience. And that was okay. Because sometimes, moving forward meant taking small steps, one day at a time. The days following Gavin's confrontation left Jack with more questions than answers. He had stood by Lucy in the moment, offering support, but now that the dust had settled, he found himself alone with his thoughts more than ever. Despite his growing resolve to let go of past pain and resentment, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on a tightrope. Every interaction with Lucy felt loaded, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. It was becoming clear to Jack that the work he was doing to help Lucy, while important, was also stirring up old feelings. He had spent years building walls around himself, protecting his heart from the pain of their past relationship, and now, it seemed those walls were crumbling piece by piece. He wasn't sure whether he was ready for this, or if he was just complicating things further by getting involved. But then again, Lucy needed him. She had made it clear that she didn't want to go through this alone, and Jack couldn't turn his back on her, not after everything they'd been through. It was a delicate balance, helping her without losing himself in the process. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, as Jack was preparing to head out of the hotel, Lucy called him. Hey, Jack, she said, her voice softer than usual. Can we talk? Sure, Jack replied, his heart racing a little. The way she said it made him uneasy. What's on your mind? Lucy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I'm still trying to figure things out with Gavin. He's been pushing me, and I feel like I'm losing control of my own decisions. I don't know if I can keep up this facade, Jack. Jack could hear the uncertainty in her voice, and it broke something inside of him. He didn't want to see her suffer, not after everything that had already happened. He couldn't bear to watch her fall apart again, especially when it felt like she was teetering on the edge. Lucy, listen to me, Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. You don't have to keep pretending. You've done so much already, and it's okay to be vulnerable. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jack knew that what she needed wasn't just words of encouragement, she needed reassurance. She needed someone who believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. I don't know how to do this, Lucy said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. I'm scared, Jack. I'm scared that I'll never be able to make the right choices again. That I'll keep messing up. Jack's chest tightened at the sound of her pain. He had seen this side of Lucy before, the side that was broken, afraid, unsure of her own strength. And yet, in that vulnerability, there was a beauty that Jack couldn't ignore. She was still the woman he had once loved, still the woman who had managed to break through his defenses, even after everything. You've already made the hardest choice, Jack said softly. You're choosing to move forward. You're choosing to not let the past define you. And that's more than most people can say. Lucy was silent for a long moment, and Jack could hear the soft sounds of her breathing through the phone. Then, finally, she spoke again, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you, Jack, she whispered. I don't know what I'd do without you. Jack's heart sank at her words. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. A quiet acknowledgement that, despite everything, they were still connected in a way he hadn't fully realized until now. He wasn't just helping her out of some sense of duty, he was there because he still cared. Anytime, Lucy, Jack replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. Anytime. A week later, Jack found himself in the same position he had been in countless times before, standing at the edge of a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. He had received a call from Clint earlier in the day, inviting him out for a drink. Clint had become more than just a mentor, he had become a sounding board, someone Jack could talk to when the weight of everything got too heavy. When Jack arrived at the bar, Clint was already there, seated at their usual table. The place was busy, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. But as Jack approached, he could feel the familiar tension in his chest. It was hard to shake the feeling that he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to leap or retreat. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, Clint said as Jack sat down across from him. He gestured for the bartender to bring over a drink. Talk to me, man. Jack rubbed his forehead, trying to push away the headache that had been brewing for hours. I don't know, Clint. I've been helping Lucy out, but it's starting to feel like too much. Like I'm getting too deep into it, and I don't know how to step back without letting her down. Clint listened quietly, his eyes thoughtful. You're not responsible for fixing everything, Jack. And you don't have to save her. But you can be there for her. You've been through a lot together, and this isn't just about helping her rebuild her business. This is about helping her rebuild herself. Jack leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his drink. I don't know if I'm the right person for that. I still have my own baggage, Clint. I don't know if I'm strong enough to be what she needs. Clint's gaze was steady. You've already been stronger than you realize. You've faced your own demons and come out the other side. Now, it's about finding balance. You don't have to be perfect, Jack. You just need to show up. The words hit Jack harder than he expected. Clint was right. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be there, both for Lucy and for himself. I don't know if I can, Jack admitted. I keep thinking that I'm going to screw this up. That I'm not enough. Clint smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. You're more than enough, Jack. Trust me. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real. And that's all you can ask for. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and laughter, but Jack felt lighter than he had in days. He knew there was no easy answer, no quick fix for the mess that had been his relationship with Lucy. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to face it. The road ahead was uncertain. There were still so many pieces to pick up, so many wounds to heal. But Jack knew that as long as he kept showing up, as long as he kept being real with Lucy, and himself, he could find his way through it. And that was enough. For a few weeks, everything seemed to be on the edge of normal. Jack continued to manage the hotel, doing his best to stay focused on work and avoid getting too tangled up in the emotional web he had woven around Lucy. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, the pull of their past, and the feelings he couldn't shake, remained with him. Lucy had been doing better. Her business was slowly getting back on track, and she seemed to be finding her footing again. But despite the outward success, Jack could sense a deeper unease in her, an unsettled quality that made him question if she was truly as okay as she appeared. And it gnawed at him, making it harder and harder to maintain the distance he had convinced himself he needed. On a crisp morning, when the hotel was quieter than usual, Jack found himself sitting in his office, staring at the blank computer screen before him. He had been working on an update to the hotel's website, but his mind kept wandering. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to think about anything other than the day-to-day tasks of the hotel and his attempts at helping Lucy rebuild her life. But today, it was different. The memories, the unspoken emotions, and the unresolved tension between them had been creeping up on him for days. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see Lucy standing in the doorway, a hesitant look on her face. She hadn't come by to visit in the last few days, not since they had last talked about Gavin. Jack had assumed she was just busy, but the concern in her eyes told him that something was off. "Hey," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Can we talk?" Jack stood up immediately, his heart skipping a beat. He could tell by the way she looked at him, her shoulders tense, her eyes searching his, that something was wrong. His protective instincts kicked in, and he nodded. "Of course. What's going on?" Lucy hesitated, glancing down at her hands for a moment as if she were gathering the strength to say whatever was on her mind. I need to tell you something. Something I should have said a while ago." Jack's stomach tightened with unease. "What is it?" "I've been keeping something from you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it's been eating away at me." Jack's heart raced. He had a sinking feeling that whatever she was about to say was going to change everything. He had been bracing himself for the possibility of more surprises in this unpredictable journey, but that didn't make it any easier. "Lucy," he started, but she raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not proud of it, Jack," she said, her voice cracking. "But after Gavin left, I started to think about everything, about what happened between us. And I realized something. I didn't just lose you because of Gavin. I pushed you away, too. I kept making excuses, and I didn't let you in when you needed to be." Jack felt his chest tighten. He had known, deep down, that part of the fallout from their past had been his fault too. He had withdrawn from her, kept his distance when what she needed most was for him to stay. But hearing her acknowledge it, hearing her admit that she had been just as responsible for the breakdown of their relationship, cut deeper than he expected. "I wasn't ready to face it back then," Lucy continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But now, I see that I made a mistake. And I'm sorry." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't been prepared for this. He had been prepared for conflict, for more tension, but not for this moment of raw honesty. He had thought that he had forgiven her, but hearing her speak those words, seeing the vulnerability in her face, made him realize that he hadn't fully let go of the pain. "Lucy, he began, but he wasn't sure what to say. The words felt inadequate, as if they couldn't capture the flood of emotions rising in him. "I didn't want to blame you. I know I pulled away, too." There was a long silence between them, a quiet understanding settling in the space. For the first time in a long while, it felt like they were truly seeing each other. The weight of their shared past was still there, but it wasn't suffocating them anymore. They were both finally acknowledging it, face to face. "Jack," Lucy whispered, taking a step closer to him. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I did. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope, maybe, we can move forward." Jack's heart ached as he looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He had spent so much time protecting himself from the pain of their past, from the wounds they had both inflicted. But here she was, asking for a chance at something new, not to fix the past, but to build a future. "I don't know if I can forget everything," Jack said softly, his voice hoarse. "But I want to try. I don't want to keep holding on to all that anger, all that hurt. I want to see if we can make something out of this." Lucy's eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and hope. "You mean that?" Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah. I do. We don't have to have all the answers right now. But I think we can start over. Slowly." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of healing, of the possibility of something new. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, and Jack instinctively wrapped his arms around her. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he could breathe again. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But as he held Lucy in his arms, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found the courage to let go of the past and step into whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of change and growth. Jack and Lucy continued to work together, supporting each other both personally and professionally. The hotel was doing better, and Lucy's business was starting to stabilize. But more than that, their relationship was slowly evolving. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. There were still days when the past reared its head, when old wounds threatened to reopen. But with every step forward, Jack and Lucy were learning to heal together. And for the first time in years, Jack believed that the future held more promise than the past ever could. For the first time in months, Jack woke up feeling like the weight of the world wasn't hanging over his shoulders. He had always been the kind of person to get up early, usually driven by the pressure of responsibilities, but today felt different. Today, he woke up with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in ages. As he made his way to the kitchen, he could hear the sounds of life in the hotel, the clatter of plates, the low murmur of voices, the hum of the coffee machine. The usual rhythm of the hotel, the kind of sound he had grown accustomed to over the years, now felt like a comforting background to his quiet thoughts. He wasn't just managing a business anymore, he was managing his life in a way that felt healthier, more balanced. The events of the past week had shifted something in Jack. He and Lucy had crossed a threshold together, and while they hadn't figured everything out, they were learning to navigate the uncertainty. Slowly, they were building something stronger than before: trust, understanding, and most of all, hope. Jack glanced out the window as he sipped his coffee. The morning light bathed the city streets below, and for the first time, he could truly see the possibilities ahead of him. He wasn't afraid of what lay ahead anymore. He didn't have to be. Not as long as he kept moving forward with intention. But there was still one thing that weighed on Jack's mind, something he hadn't fully addressed. The hotel. The reason he'd come to the city in the first place. His position here had never been just a job, it had been part of his plan to find redemption for himself. And yet, with all the emotional upheaval of the past few months, Jack had pushed that part of his life to the back burner. It was time to face that head-on. And he knew just where to start. Later that day, as the hotel settled into its usual afternoon quiet, Jack called a meeting with Clint. He hadn't told Clint about the latest developments with Lucy, he had been too caught up in his own emotions and decisions. But now, he realized that Clint's wisdom was exactly what he needed. He had always trusted Clint's judgment, and if there was ever a moment where Jack needed advice, it was now. Clint arrived at the hotel after lunch, settling into the worn leather chair across from Jack's desk. His usual easygoing demeanor was still there, but Jack could see the slight shift in Clint's posture. He was paying attention. Jack had always respected that about him, Clint was a man who could read the room, and Jack knew that Clint could see the inner conflict Jack was struggling with. "All right," Clint said after taking a sip of his drink. "What's going on? You've been a little quiet lately." Jack rubbed his forehead. "It's everything, Clint. The hotel's running well, and Lucy and I are trying to figure things out. But I've been distracted. The hotel, my role here, it's not just a job for me. It's part of my journey. I've been so focused on fixing everything else that I've lost sight of that." Clint nodded thoughtfully. "You can't fix everything, Jack. But you can focus on what matters. The hotel's not just a business, it's a part of you. You've poured a lot of yourself into this place. Maybe it's time to remember why you came here in the first place." Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall as he processed Clint's words. He had been so focused on his personal life, on helping Lucy and untangling the mess of their past, that he had neglected the very thing that had brought him here, his dream of building something of his own. The hotel had always been about more than just work, it was about finding a place where he could belong, where he could start over. "It's just hard to balance it all," Jack said, his voice full of frustration. "I want to be there for Lucy, but I also need to be here. I don't want to lose sight of the things that matter to me." Clint leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jack, you don't have to choose between your dreams and the people you care about. You're learning that now, with Lucy. You can't pour from an empty cup, though. You've got to give yourself the time to recharge, to refocus on what you want, and then you can share that with others." Jack felt the weight of Clint's words settle in. For so long, he had been running on empty, trying to give so much of himself to others without considering how much he needed to nurture his own aspirations. It was time to change that. "I know," Jack said, more to himself than to Clint. "I've been so wrapped up in trying to help everyone else, I've lost track of my own path. I need to figure out what I want, not just for Lucy or for the hotel, but for myself." Clint smiled, his easygoing nature returning. "That's the spirit. You're on the right track, Jack. Just remember, you're allowed to prioritize your own happiness too. It's not selfish. It's necessary." Jack gave a small smile, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a while, he felt like he had a clearer perspective. He wasn't abandoning Lucy or the hotel, he was simply choosing to take charge of his own future. It was an important distinction, one that would allow him to be more present for the people he cared about, without losing sight of his own needs. Later that evening, Jack found himself standing outside the hotel, looking up at the building. The neon lights buzzed softly, casting a glow over the sidewalk. It wasn't the grandest place in the city, but it was his dream, his hard work, and now, his future. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. His relationship with Lucy wasn't perfect, and the path of rebuilding wasn't a straight line. But he was learning to accept the uncertainty, knowing that the only thing he could control was the effort he put into each day. And tonight, he was ready to put that effort into his future. He had let go of the fear, and now, it was time to take the next step forward. He took a deep breath and turned toward the entrance. The future was waiting for him, and he was finally ready to meet it head-on. The weeks that followed Jack's decision to focus on himself and the hotel were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. The hotel was running smoothly, and Lucy seemed to have found a renewed sense of purpose in her work. Jack continued to keep a careful balance, giving her space to heal while still providing the support she needed. It was working, or so he thought. One evening, as Jack was wrapping up some late paperwork, his phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen to see Lucy's name flashing. A smile tugged at his lips, but it quickly faded when he saw the urgency in her message. "We need to talk. Please meet me at the cafe down the street." His heart skipped a beat. It had been a while since they had such serious conversations, and the abruptness of her request sent a wave of concern through him. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed his jacket and left the hotel, his mind racing with questions. The small cafe, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, was Lucy's favorite spot. It was quiet, intimate, and the smell of fresh coffee always gave it a comforting atmosphere. But tonight, the place felt different, heavy, as if the air itself was thick with tension. Jack spotted Lucy sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her gaze distant. "Hey," Jack said softly, approaching her. She looked up, her eyes already full of emotion. Without a word, she motioned for him to sit down. "Lucy, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice low but filled with concern. She took a deep breath, glancing down at her mug before meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking about everything, about what we're doing, where we're going, and I need to be honest with you. I think I've been holding back." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucy hesitated before speaking again. I've been pushing you away, Jack. Not in the same way as before, but in a different way. I think I'm afraid of trusting you again. And I don't want to keep doing that to you, to us." The words hit Jack like a punch in the stomach. He had thought they were past the deep cracks in their relationship, but hearing Lucy's confession made him realize that trust was still the biggest wall between them. The wall they had never fully broken down. "I've been trying, Lucy," Jack said quietly, his throat tightening. "I'm not perfect, but I'm here. I'm here for you." "I know," she whispered. "And that's the problem. You've been there for me, but I haven't been there for you. I've been keeping you at arm's length because I'm scared of what happens if I let you in again. I don't want to get hurt, Jack." Jack swallowed hard. This wasn't the first time she had admitted her fears. It wasn't even the first time he had felt this shift between them. But hearing her say it, acknowledging the walls she had built around herself, felt like the hardest blow yet. "I can't do this alone, Lucy," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I've been trying to understand you, to give you space, but I'm not asking you to do this alone either. I don't want to keep dancing around it. If we're going to move forward, we both have to let go of the past. We have to trust each other." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Jack thought she might say something to push him away, to hold him at arm's length once again. But instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with his. "I want to, Jack," she said softly. "I really do. But it's so hard. And I don't know if I'm ready to give you everything." Jack squeezed her hand gently, his heart aching. He had known this was coming, had known that there were still hurdles they needed to face. But this felt like the real test. The one where they either chose to be honest and vulnerable with each other or let the past control their future. "Lucy," he began, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to give everything right now. I'm asking you to trust me, just a little bit more. You don't have to be perfect. Neither do I. But we can't keep holding on to our fears and our regrets. We can't let them control us anymore." The tears in Lucy's eyes spilled over, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of release, of the burden she had been carrying. For so long, she had tried to protect herself, to keep her heart guarded. But in doing so, she had pushed away the one person who had always been there for her. "I'm sorry," Lucy whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been so scared." Jack pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between them. But in that moment, he also felt something else, a glimmer of hope. Maybe they weren't as lost as they had thought. Maybe, just maybe, they could still find their way back to each other. "I'm not going anywhere, Lucy," Jack said softly, his cheek resting against the top of her head. "We're in this together. But we have to face it, all of it. Together." The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people finally understanding each other, two people finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable in a way they had never done before. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack believed in the possibility of a future with Lucy, a future where they weren't defined by the mistakes of the past but by their willingness to move forward, hand in hand. The days after that night were quiet but transformative. Jack and Lucy continued to work on their relationship, slowly rebuilding the trust they had both lost. There were still moments of doubt, times when old fears crept in, but they faced them together. Every day felt like a small victory, a step closer to something they both desperately wanted, a chance at true healing. And yet, despite the progress they had made, Jack knew the real test was still ahead. Trust wasn't something you could simply fix overnight. It would take time. But he was ready. For once, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. The next few weeks were full of small victories and small setbacks for Jack and Lucy. They spent time together in ways they hadn't before, no longer just as partners in a hotel venture, but as two people trying to rebuild what they had lost. The days were long, filled with conversations that went deeper than they had ever gone before, and sometimes those conversations were painful. But through it all, Jack could feel a shift in the way they interacted. The distance between them was closing. They weren't fully there yet, trust was still a work in progress, but they had made the most important decision, to keep moving forward together, no matter what the past had held. One evening, after the hotel had settled for the night and the guests had all gone to their rooms, Jack and Lucy found themselves sitting in the quiet of the hotel's lobby. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of glassware from the bar filled the air, but in the moment, it was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. It was just them, two people trying to figure out what came next. "Jack," Lucy started, her voice soft, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you." Jack looked up from the stack of paperwork in front of him. He had been going through the usual evening routine, but Lucy's tone caught his attention. He could hear the weight in her voice. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his work. She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the floor. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about everything. About the past, about us, about what I want for my future, and I realize that there's something I've been hiding. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Jack's heart began to race, a mixture of dread and curiosity flooding his chest. He set the papers aside and leaned forward, his full attention on her. "Lucy, you're scaring me," he said softly. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, looking at him with a vulnerability he hadn't seen in a while. "When I came to this city, I had nothing. I was broken. I had no family, no real friends. And when I met you, I didn't know how to trust anyone, least of all myself. But something about you, your kindness, your patience, made me feel safe. But I've been running from my past ever since. And it's time I stopped." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. "Lucy, whatever it is, we'll get through it together." She squeezed his hand but still couldn't meet his eyes. "Jack, the truth is, I was in an abusive relationship before I came here. The guy I was with, he wasn't kind. He manipulated me, made me feel like I wasn't enough. I didn't leave him because I didn't know how. I thought if I could just be better, if I could just try harder, he would change. But he didn't. And when I finally got away, I was left with nothing but fear." Jack's heart clenched in his chest. He had known there were parts of her past that she kept hidden, but hearing her speak so openly about her pain made the truth even harder to bear. It was a stark reminder of how much she had been through, and how much she had carried alone. "I didn't want to tell you, Jack, because I didn't want you to look at me differently. I didn't want to burden you with my past. But I can't keep hiding it from you. It's part of who I am, and if we're ever going to be truly honest with each other, I have to tell you everything." Jack was quiet for a moment, processing what she had said. He could see the weight of her words hanging in the air, but he didn't want to rush her or push her to say more than she was ready to. "Lucy," Jack said after a beat, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I'm not going to look at you any differently. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you, whatever you've been through, whatever you're still working through. You don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. Lucy's eyes filled with tears again, and this time, they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of relief. She leaned forward and rested her head on Jack's shoulder, her breath shaky as she tried to control her emotions. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she whispered. I don't want to hide from my past. I want to build a future with you, Jack. A real future. But I need to be whole, and I need you to help me. Jack held her, his arms wrapped around her in a way that felt protective, but also deeply understanding. I'll help you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We'll take this one step at a time. You don't have to do this alone. They sat there for a long time, in the quiet of the hotel lobby, holding each other as the night stretched on. It was the first time in a long time that Jack felt like he could truly understand the weight of what Lucy had been carrying. Her pain, her fear, they were all pieces of her story that had shaped who she was. And while Jack knew that he couldn't erase those parts of her past, he could be there to help her navigate through them. It wasn't going to be easy. The journey ahead would be filled with ups and downs, moments of progress and setbacks. But one thing was certain, they were in it together. They had chosen to face the past, not just as individuals, but as partners. And that, Jack realized, was the truest test of their commitment. As the weeks went by, Lucy took small steps toward healing, and Jack was there every step of the way. He learned to listen more, to give her the space she needed while also offering support when she asked for it. Their relationship deepened in ways Jack hadn't expected, but it wasn't without its challenges. They were both learning how to be vulnerable, how to trust again, and how to rebuild the pieces of themselves they had lost along the way. But despite the difficulties, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally heading in the right direction. They had faced their fears. They had faced their pasts. And together, they were stronger than ever. The sun set low on the horizon, casting an amber glow over the hotel. It had been months since Jack and Lucy sat together in the cafe, uncertain of where their relationship was heading. But now, as they walked through the lobby, side by side, there was a quiet confidence between them. The kind that only came after facing the hardest truths and coming out the other side stronger. The hotel had transformed in many ways since that night. Not just in its appearance, though the renovations and upgrades were impressive. No, the real transformation had taken place within the people who ran it. Jack had learned to be more patient, to listen, and to be vulnerable when needed. And Lucy had learned to trust, to open up, and to finally let go of the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but it was now built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The kind of foundation that could weather any storm. Jack had just finished meeting with a group of investors to discuss the future of the hotel. The renovations were nearly complete, and with the hotel now drawing in a steady stream of guests, it was clear that the business was on the rise. But more importantly, Jack and Lucy had made a decision that would change everything. They were ready to expand. We're going to do this, Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence between them as they walked down the hall. This is just the beginning. Lucy smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of quiet pride and anticipation. I know. I feel it, too. But we're doing it differently this time, right? Jack stopped and turned to face her. Absolutely. No more secrets. No more holding back. We face everything together. That's the only way it works. Lucy nodded, her expression soft but determined. Together, she repeated. They had been through so much, doubt, fear, pain, and loss, but through it all, they had never lost sight of what was most important, each other. And now, they stood on the cusp of a new chapter, one that held endless possibilities. Jack, Lucy began again, her voice gentle but filled with meaning. I've been thinking a lot about the future. About what comes next. And I want you to know that I'm ready. Ready for whatever this new chapter brings. Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. There was a steadiness to her now that hadn't been there before. It was as if the weight she had carried for so long had finally lifted, and she was free to move forward. Not just in her life, but in their shared life. "I'm ready too," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "And whatever happens, Lucy, we'll face it together. No matter what the future holds." Lucy's smile deepened, and she reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing lightly over his skin. The simple gesture spoke volumes, conveying all the love and trust that had been built between them. "I love you, Jack," she whispered. Jack's heart swelled. There was a time when he had doubted whether they could ever get to this point. A time when the walls between them had seemed too high to ever climb. But now, standing there with Lucy, he knew the truth: they had already climbed those walls, together. And the future was theirs to shape. "I love you too, Lucy," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And I always will." They stood there, in the quiet of the hotel, hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so uncertain. They had come through the darkest parts of their journey, and now, they were ready for the light. As Jack looked around the hotel, the familiar hum of activity swirling around him, he knew that they had not only saved the hotel, but they had saved each other. The business had flourished, but it was the growth in their relationship that was the true success. And as the night grew darker and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jack realized that their story was far from over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, as the hotel guests began to filter in for breakfast and the staff went about their morning routines, Jack and Lucy stood side by side, taking it all in. There was a sense of peace now, a calm that had been absent in the past. They had both come so far, not just professionally, but personally as well. They had built something together, something that would last. And as they watched the sunrise outside the hotel's grand windows, they both knew that the future was bright. Whatever challenges might come, they were ready. Together. The hotel was more than just a business to them now. It was a symbol of their resilience, their love, and their unwavering commitment to each other. And for the first time in a long time, they could both see clearly what the future held: a new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?